Good morning, LinkedIn. My name is Joel Bennett, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest episode of Practical Leadership, an opportunity for you to learn how to be a more effective leader, as well as build in leadership practices and habits into your daily work. If you're tuning in live, this is the point in the program where I'd love for you to say hello in the comments and share where you're tuning in from. And if you can, share with us what you've been focused on over the last week in your own leadership. If you were here last week on our active listening session with Christy Mertens, if that was an area you've been trying to work on, being an active listener in the workplace, again, share what you've been doing. And if you have anything to celebrate today, we'd love to see it in the chat. So let's see who we've got here today. Tom, thanks for joining us from Raycom. Great to have you here. As you introduce yourself as well, feel free to drop in any other comments you want. Megan, thanks for joining us. Megan, I think you might be a first timer here. If not, I apologize, but welcome. I hope you find today to be an exceptional use of your time. We'll see who else starts dropping in here as we go. I'm going to mention today at the beginning, I've got a lot going on here. We're trying a different setup. I'm going to use a couple of slides today, which is not typical. So if I'm looking in different directions, it's not because I'm distracted as much as because I'm trying to pull maybe more levers than I'm used to. If you haven't joined us before, during these sessions, we try to tackle real leadership topics and challenges to encourage you to apply what you're learning and provide you actionable steps along the way to weave into your own leadership practices or team culture. So typically I ask leadership experts from around the world to join me. We've had Canadians, we've had Australians, we've got some Americans, but today I've given them all the day off. So I guess you're stuck with me. I'm going to be focused more on diagnosing performance and specifically people performance issues in the workplace during this session today, and how do we tackle those? How do we determine what they are, get to the root cause, and move towards some sort of solution? And I'm excited to get started with that. It's an area that I have a lot of passion around, and you're going to see that today. But before I do, I want to reinforce with you throughout the session, I'd love for you to be active in the comments. One, because it's nice to be able to talk to an audience. But two, I want to make sure I get your perspectives and any questions that you have on the topic. As much as possible today, I'd like to use this in some ways as a little bit of a workshop for some of the things that you're struggling with as you approach performance issues with your teams. And so if we have time today, as you throw those questions in, I'd love to cover them. If not, and we run out of time, putting those in the comments is a great way for me to be able to follow up with you right after the session. I'll jump in and provide some thoughts. There are going to be times where what you need help with is not something you want to broadcast publicly. What I would encourage you to do then is to send me a message via LinkedIn. If we're connected, that's easy. If we're not connected, you should still be able to do it, but we may need to get connected to kind of continue those conversations. I'm happy to lend some advice if it's helpful. So we have a few more folks that have been jumping in. Sean, thanks for joining us from Indiana. Caitlin from Wisconsin. Jamie Jolie from Lean Tech, I think in Tennessee. Megan and Ankeny. Megan, I think you just earned your Practical Leadership Groupie badge today. You've been on a handful of our sessions before. Christy Mertens is in the house. She was our guest last week. And it's great to have her here. So it looks like we've got a pretty full house, but if you're still joining us, continue to drop that into the chat. I'd love to hear or love to see who's listening to us today. So with all that, let's go ahead and get started. So one of the biggest things that I see in my practice, as far as questions that I get from leaders that we coach, that we do training with, the number one question is always, hey, I've got somebody on my team that's not meeting my expectations. Their performance is not where it needs to be. Their question typically is, how do I figure out what's really going on? What's the root cause of that? And then, of course, how do I fix it? Or how do I try to improve it? And so the first step, the first thing I always tell them is, I'm going to need you to change your mindset a little bit. And that mindset specifically is, I need to take off, or have you take off your judge robe, like Judge Wapner, Judge Judy, where you think you know what's going on in the situation, or that you're judging the person and their performance. And I want you to take that robe off and put on kind of that private detective's hat, that Sherlock Holmes hat, Because what we're going to try to do through the process is rule out suspects. Because typically there are a number of things that could be going on, some of which may be beyond what you're assuming. And so it's not always about what's present. Sometimes it's about what's not present. And just like we would have suspects in a crime, we want to rule out suspects so we get the pool to a small number that we can actually push into. The way that we'll do that, and we're going to use a process today, I'll show a couple of slides here. The process we're going to use is a simple one. And what we do is work from the easiest thing to fix or to improve to the hardest things to fix. And this is going to be from a leadership perspective. So you as the leader or the manager in the situation, what you need to be doing. And so I'm going to use a model today. I'm going to go ahead and pull that up on the screen. And hopefully you can see this well through the recording. Again, if you have any issues, feel free to drop that in the chat. I'm happy to restate anything along the way. So the first thing we need to understand is we're diagnosing performance issues and we work our way from easiest to hardest. The first step for us to assess is around awareness, and specifically awareness around the expectations that we have for the performance that we're asking them to turn in. And so if somebody has unclear expectations, it's very hard for them to turn in the performance that we would like. So there's really three areas that we'd like you to focus in on. One is the outcome. So whether this is a job, a task, a new responsibility, what's the final outcome that you would like to see from them? Paint that big picture. What does success look like? And make sure that we're clear about the outcome. And so when they can see it, they can understand it, there's a much better chance that they'll actually reach it. The second piece is around the activities, those non-negotiable activities, they're going to get you to that outcome. And so, in different roles, that could be a process, those could be steps. I think about, if you had a salesperson, one of their non-negotiable activities may be, keeping an updated CRM, right? Logging in what they're doing with customers, because their end goal is obviously to sell, right? To sell so many new customers per week, per month. And so that'd be a non-negotiable activity. And then the last piece is actually your approach, or the approach that you would expect. And this is around kind of the mindset, the behaviors, the attitudes that we bring to our job. It's the how we do things. And so many of us have been in situations where somebody can get the job done, but the way that they do it, the how, is what creates the performance issue or creates other issues with the team. And so to set clear expectations, we have to have all three. What's the outcome? What are those activities, those non-negotiable activities, and what's the approach? And if we haven't been clear on those before, we need to set those expectations, or we need to reset those expectations and make sure, confirm that they understand what's expected of them and get a commitment from them going forward that that's what they're going to push towards. So that's the first one, is awareness. That's the easiest because I wasn't aware, now I'm aware. The next step is around capability. And the thought process around capability is, are they fully equipped to do the job or to do the task? And so there's really three levels of capability here. And again, we're going to start from easiest and move on to the hardest of the three. The first one is tools. So this could be physical tools. It could be a hammer. It could be their computer. But it could also be things like information. It could be resources. It could be, the people resources, people that they would call on if they have issues, or having the right team around them. And so all of those pieces would be the tools they need to get the job done. Now, it's important. One of the things I'm starting to notice in the workplace, because the labor market is so tough, with more jobs open than we have people to fill, I'm seeing some leaders that'll say, hey, John is not meeting expectations right now. He's not getting the work done we need to get done. And so when we dig into tools and we talk about people resources, I'll say, well, how big is John's team? The folks that are involved in getting this done. And they'll say, well, it's a team of 5, but we only have 3 people. We're trying to, fill the other 2 roles. And my question to them is, well, if then you're asking John to do the work that would fill in the gaps for 2 other people, have you actually reset those expectations for him? And if you haven't, is that actually a logical thing to do? Is that rational for us to say, John, you're going to be able to pick up the gap that we have for having two less people on the team? So I'm not providing the right resources. I probably need to reset my expectations. The next one is skills. Skills are typically things that can be picked up in a short amount of time. They're things that we can train people on. And so this could be in hours, it could be days, it could be weeks, it could be months. If you think about a training curve or a learning curve, it's the things along the way that kind of build upon other knowledge, and it's skills that we can develop. And so really around skills, the way we do this is through training, through mentoring, through coaching, but it's also through repetition. And so the more that we do something, the closer to mastery that we get. So if you have somebody that's struggling from a capability standpoint and you've identified there are skills issues here, things that additional training they may need or coaching they may need, partnering up with a mentor or kind of a buddy in the workplace, or it could be around providing them more repetition. This is another issue that we see from time to time. Somebody's worked for a company for 6 months and I'll hear from a leader, hey, they're just not where we would want them to be. There are a couple of these things that they're still struggling with. And when we push into repetition, what we find is they've only had a chance to do that task a couple of times. And that's typically not the amount of repetition we want for mastery. So if something's only happening quarterly and they're 6 months into the job, they've only had 2 opportunities to do it. And so do we need to reset our expectations of where they should be at specific points in their career or kind of the project? The third piece here, and the hardest of the 3, is talents. And so talents, sometimes we use the word skills and talents interchangeably. When I work with leaders, I prefer that we do not. Skills being trainable in a short amount of time, talents are typically more innate abilities that people already bring to the table. And so the way I'll explain this, a simple example would be if I said I wanted to learn how to play the piano, pretty quickly you could teach me how to play chopsticks, right? It's specific notes in a specific pattern. And if I repeat that over and over again, I should be able to learn how to play chopsticks, sometimes within a day, but definitely probably by the end of the week, I could play chopsticks for you. That's a skill, right? It's a very specific process. But if you ask me to play in front of Carnegie Hall at the end of this month, a really complicated piece or maybe an original work, I wouldn't be able to do it because that's something I have to bring. I have to bring that skill to the table. Bring that talent to the table. And it's something that I really have mastered or I'm in the process of mastering over time. And so for me, you could train me, daily, weekly, monthly, hours upon hours. And for those of you that know me well would say, Joel does not have that musical ability. And so I would not be a good fit as a choice to play in front of Carnegie Hall. And that's really what we look at in capability. When we get to the point where we say, I'm not really sure this person is going to improve to the point where they could consistently do the job and something they could fall back on from the talent perspective, I typically have a fit issue. And that doesn't mean that we fire somebody. It typically would mean, is this the right role? Is this the right task? Is this the right responsibility for that person if I want to set them up for success? And so again, through capability, start with tools. We rule out those suspects. Do I have everything, or have I given everything that they need to do the job? Once I've ruled that out, I go on to skills. Have I provided the training and repetition needed for them to get where they need to be successful? And then the third is, do they actually have the talents, the innate abilities it's going to take to do this job well? All right. So that brings us to the third. And the third is around willingness. And just like the others, there are multiple layers of willingness. The first one is the word we use here is fear. And some people don't like that word in the workplace, but it's not being afraid of somebody. It's more a fear of failure. It's a fear of mistakes. And typically where we talk about this in the workplace is around confidence, that so-and-so isn't confident in doing the job or to taking on more responsibility. And so confidence is in many ways a fear of failure. And so how do we combat that? How do we improve that? A big part is making sure that they know that we feel confident in them, that we chose them for this job, this role, this responsibility for a reason, and that we're here to support them in that we know that mistakes are going to happen, but that we're not going to focus on the mistakes, we're going to focus on the progress. And so while those mistakes may happen, it's not about the mistake, it's about learning from that mistake and not repeating it. And so along this learning curve, along this change curve, I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to coach you along the way to help you become successful in it. Once we address the confidence issue, that fear component of unwillingness starts to disappear or dissolve. The next piece is inflexibility. Inflexibility is more about change, and so this is where you hear from people, well, they're willing to do it their way, but not our way, or maybe they've been doing it this way for 10 years, but we've come up with a new process or a new way of interacting with people, and all of a sudden now they're saying, I would prefer to do it my way, or they say they're going to do it the new way and they do it their way. Inflexibility in many ways, when we're talking about change, is just a different shade of fear. And again, this is a fear of failure, but it's a little bit different in that when I do it my way, when I do X, I know I'm going to get Y. And I've typically been successful in doing it my way before. If I hadn't, I probably would have adjusted my approach already. But when I'm faced with doing it somebody else's way or doing it a new way that's unproven, now when I do X, the new X, I'm not sure what's going to come out on the other end, the new Y. And so when I look at that, I can say, I'm going to risk it and do the new process and likely fail, at least in my mind. I could do that, or I could choose to continue to do it my way and know the result I'm going to get. And so when we talk about inflexibility around change, again, we go back to part of this is a confidence issue. It's definitely a fear of mistakes or failure, because if I do it your way and I fail, I look bad. And I can't be sure that your process is actually better than mine. And so really this is around, again, building up some confidence, letting them know that they are capable of this, that you feel like that their background and experience actually will lend itself well to the process. But more importantly, that you're not dropping this on their plate and hanging them out to dry, letting them kind of go out in the world to figure this out on their own, that you're there to support them along the way. And again, that mistakes won't be made. It won't be perfect the first time, but that together, kind of arm in arm, we're going to work through this together to get to a level of performance that's at least equal to, if not higher than what we saw before. And so again, we work from easiest to hardest: fear first, confidence, inflexibility around change, and then we go to the toughest one, and that's around defiance. And I'll tell you, of all of these, awareness, capability, and at least the first two of willingness, the vast majority of the issues we see, I would say high 80s to 95% of the issues that we see, maybe even 99% of the issues that we see in the workplace, would focus on those, and the remaining, which is a very small percentage, would be around defiance. And defiance being, I'm not going to do it your way. I'm not going to do it somebody else's way. And I'm not even going to necessarily do it my way. I'm just not going to do it. And so typically we see defiance as being, we see it as a lack of respect, either for you or for others on the team. It's kind of a lack of an understanding of what the client needs, the team needs, the company needs. It's really just about me. It in some ways feels very selfish. And you'll probably note when you're here, when you feel like you've done everything that you can do, you've gotten to a dead end around performance with this person, and now it comes down to a choice, right? And so hopefully by now you've talked about the impact of their performance. You've talked about the consequences of not improving. And at this point, we really need to follow through on those consequences. And typically those consequences are, could be a demotion, it could be a corrective action procedure, up to and including termination. But our role as a leader at this point is actually to follow through on the consequences we've set for it. The problem is many leaders get to this point and they see this as a battle of wills, and then they go to, well, I just don't have the time or energy to deal with this today, so I'm going to ignore it, or I'm going to hope it goes away, hope they change their mind. And for many of us, we recognize that that just doesn't happen. And so following through on those consequences, even when it's tough, to have those tough coaching conversations around, hey, we are at an impasse or we're at a dead end. Sometimes understanding those consequences will get somebody to reverse course and start working toward a resolution. But often you may find at this point, the best thing, the only thing that you can do is move on from that person, either in that role or move that person out of the organization. So you can see as we work through awareness, capability, willingness, as we go, each of these ramps up in the difficulty. the amount of time and effort it's going to take you to work through the process with the person. But it's important that we do it in that order. All right, so I'm going to pause briefly. Would love to just get any comments that you have or questions so far, because once we go a little bit further, and already we're about 20 minutes into this session, I'm gonna move somewhat quickly to kind of give you some tips or pointers. But if anybody has any questions or situations that you want us to work through, what could be going on, this would be a great time for you to start dropping those in the comments. So I'm going to give a minute to see if anything comes in. All right, so it's very possible that you're typing along and you type as slowly as I do. So I'm going to leave that option out there, and we'll just talk about a couple of things to be considering. So as you are diagnosing performance issues, one of the things we need to do is make sure that we don't make assumptions. We need to stick with the facts. And the facts are things that we can actually see evident, that we could prove to somebody else, and to understand that sometimes our brain makes our assumptions facts, or at least that we believe that they're facts. One thing you need to understand about the brain, part of the brain, the amygdala, its only role is to identify threats, right? And so if it sees something and it seems to be a threat, it's going to go on guard. The alarms are going to sound. It's going to put up its dukes and defend itself. When it sees something that's not a threat, obviously those alarms don't sound. We're more comfortable. We interact with it. But if we're not sure, the brain's job is to keep us safe, and so it's going to sound the alarm anyway and say, maybe he's not good enough. We need to be on the defense. Where this comes into diagnosing performance issues or working with performance issues on your team is when you set an expectation, or you have an expectation for somebody in their performance, and they don't meet that expectation, the brain automatically goes that this is a threat, right? This person is a threat to my success, or to my process, or whatever, right? Sometimes it can be a pride piece as well. And so because of that, our brain goes into fight mode, or at least defense mode, and looks at that as this is a willingness issue, right? They're not doing it because they're not willing. They don't want to take ownership. They're lazy, all those things that we would put in the willingness camp. When the truth of the matter is, there are likely awareness issues and capability issues that are at play that may be also influencing their willingness. Meaning, if I don't know exactly what you expect from me, or I don't feel like I've got all the tools or skills, training that I need to do the job, I'm going to be afraid, right? I'm going to be fearful or not confident, which is going to lead me to be unwilling. There are also going to be times where if I don't feel like you're supporting me appropriately with, skills, the training, just telling me you're confident in my abilities, that I may become unwilling, inflexible, maybe even to the point of defiance. And so I think it's important for us to not jump to conclusions, and we have to battle in some ways the natural way that we're wired. Our brain is wired around assuming that people are kind of have the worst intent, that unwillingness, versus some of the other pieces that we can actually control. So check in here to see what we've got coming in. Christy mentions kind of the metaphor around skills practice. Yeah, that's been a good one for me. Another one, if music is not your forte, I always tell people, if an NBA team lost their top rebounder and brought me in for a tryout, they could teach me how to block out. They could teach me how to understand where the ball typically comes off the rim, or maybe even work with me on hustle, but they're not going to be able to train me to be tall or to jump high, right? Those are innate talents. And so you at times have to be thinking about the role in the same way. Shannon, individuals who believe they're ready for promotion have had the difficult conversations that they're not ready, and it's my fault. Okay, Shannon, there feels like there's a lot more to that. I would love to unpack that with you a little bit, just to get a little bit more information. If you're willing, just shoot me a message on LinkedIn and let's talk about that in more detail. There are a couple things that could be going on. One is if you've got somebody that feels like they're ready, but they're not ready, and you've set the expectation that they're not ready, have you also set the expectation of what needs to happen for them to be ready? And maybe that's, again, skills that they need to develop. It could be the attitudes, behaviors they bring to the job. But there could be times where they're just not capable, right? That they don't have the talent to do that job. And so if you've had that difficult conversation, and I may be reading into your comments here, but they still feel like they're ready, part of that is, I will put it on you as the leader, because we have to be super clear. And that it's not us just holding them back because we don't believe in them, but we're trying to set them up for success and not failure. And so where we may see something in them that they can't see, we need to make sure that we make that explicit and not implicit, that they are guessing as to what's going on there, that we need to kind of put all of our cards on the table, but do it in such a way that they understand that we want them to be successful. And to do that, as part of our role is to be honest, but to provide opportunities for them to improve. But make sure that that's a two-way dialogue. It's not a lecture. You're not calling them to the principal's office to have that, go through that process, but that it is a two-way discussion, maybe to understand where they're coming from as well. I'm reading in a lot to your comment here, Shannon. So if it's helpful, shoot me a message during the session, after the session, and maybe we can talk it out either through messaging or maybe even to jump on a call real quick to walk through it. I'm going to double check to see if there's anything else here. Feel free if you have other questions. But as you do that, I want to make sure I'm staying on time here. We're about 25 minutes in. I typically like to keep these around 30. Thanks, Shannon. It's good to know that I guessed well. So thanks for telling me I nailed it. You just helped my confidence level today. But again, keep dropping those situations in. I can answer some of these once we get off the call as well. Or again, feel free to reach out to me. So if you've been here before, this is the part in the program where we try to get you to focus on one simple step that you can take to put this into practice this week. So where I'd like you to focus, and where I typically see the greatest majority of leaders struggle with this, is that whole thing around jumping to conclusions. And so what I'd like you to do as you bump into performance issues, whether it's with an individual on your team or the team in general, is to not jump straight to willingness, right? To assume that they're doing this because they don't, they're lazy, they don't want to work very hard, they don't want to stick with it, whatever. To rule out those other suspects of awareness and capability first, and to do it in order, right? I think if you go through and start asking the questions, have I been clear enough? Do they understand the outcome? Do they know what success looks like? Do they know what it's going to take to get there, the activities I expect? And do they understand the how? If you just even start there, you're going to find you have a lot of work to do before you move to capability or willingness. And so once you cross those things off your list and you're sure that awareness isn't the issue, then you can jump to the next one, which is capability or willingness. So fight that urge of jumping to willingness first, and ask yourself the question, how can I be clearer on expectations, or give them the tools or the training or the repetition to be successful here. All right. So LinkedIn, I've said this before, LinkedIn can be used for a lot of things, some good, some bad. But today I'd like it to use it for your good, to be a little bit of a catalyst for action, and for some of you, accountability. So you invested the time today, so far 28 minutes, to learn more about how do I diagnose performance issues or work with performance issues on my team. And I appreciate you being here, but that time is going to be completely wasted if you don't do something with it. So with that in mind, I want you to identify your one thing that you're going to commit to doing over the next 7 days to take your leadership to the next level. And once you have that, I want you to drop it into the comments. And I do that for two reasons. Every once in a while, I'll get a message from somebody saying, do I really need to put it there? The reason that we put it down is, one, for you to formulate it in your mind, what you're going to focus in on. It becomes a reminder for you during the week. So if I say I'm going to focus on this, when that situation comes up down the road, it's going to be a reminder that I said I was going to do that. And now it's about following through and doing it. The other piece is, once you've put it out there, it helps me to determine topics that we may need to push into the future. So I appreciate you doing both, one for action and also accountability, but also to help me out. So take 15 seconds now, drop that in the comments. But while you're doing that, I want to just talk about what's going to happen next week. I mentioned that I invite other experts into this process, and next week will be no exception to that. I'm excited to announce that we're going to have operational coach and strategy expert Laura Creston join us to talk about how to create a blueprint for your own productivity. This was a topic a few weeks ago that we got a lot of positive comments on, and we're going to dig in from a little bit different viewpoint or vantage point this time around. So keep your eyes open for that LinkedIn event. And please, if it's of interest to you, feel free to drop a note in the chat. I'm happy to personally invite you so you don't miss it. But it'll be again next week, Wednesday at 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern. So, again, I want to encourage you to take something that you learned, but if this has been helpful for you, come back next week. And if you think it could be helpful to a friend or a colleague, please share it with them if you think they would benefit from it. And if you've stumbled upon this video and we're not connected on LinkedIn, send me a connection request and mention that you were part of the episode today, and I'll remedy that. I'd love to connect with you and learn more about what you do and how I may be able to support you. But regardless, I want to thank you again for joining us, and I hope to see you again next week. Blessings.